Chapter 8. Professor Slocum sat at his study desk, surrounded by the ever-present clutter of dusty tomes. Behind him, twin shafts of sunlight entered the tall French windows and glittered upon his mane of pure white hair, casting a gaunt shadow across the mountain of books onto the exquisite Persian carpet which pelted the floor with clusters of golden roses. The professor peered through his ivory-rimmed pince-nez and painstakingly annotated the crackling yellow pages of an ancient book, the Count of Saint-Germain's treatise upon the transmutation of base metals and the improvement of diamonds. The similarities between his marginal jottings and the hand-inscribed text of the now legendary Count were such as would raise the eyebrows of many a seasoned graphologist. Had it not been for the fact that the Count of Saint-Germain had cast his exaggerated shadow in the fashionable places of some 300 years past, one would have been tempted to assume that both inscriptions were the product of a single hand, the Count's text appearing only the work of a younger and more sprightly individual. But even to suggest such a thing would be to trespass dangerously upon the shores of unreason, although it must be said that old Pete, one of the borough's most notable octogenarians, was wont to recall that when he was naught but a tussle-haired sprog with ringworm and rickets, the professor was already a gentleman of great age. Around and about the study, the musty showcases were crowded with a profusion of extraordinary objects. The tall bookshelves bulged with rare volumes, and the carved tables stood heavily burdened with brass orreries and silver astrolabes. All these wonders hovered in the half-light, exhibits of a private museum born to the professor's esoteric taste. Golden, dusty motes hung in the sunlight shafts, and the room held a silence which was all its own. Beyond the French windows, the wonderful garden bloomed throughout every season with a luxuriant display of exotic flora. But beyond the walls existed a changing world for which the professor had very little time. He trod the boundaries of the borough each day at sunrise, attended certain local functions, principally the yearly darts tournament at the Flying Swan, and accepted his role as oracle and ornamental hermit to the folk of Brentford. O'Malley's hobnails clattered across the cobbled stones of the Butts estate, Pooley's Blakey's offering a light accompaniment as the two marched purposefully forward. "No sign of the wandering camel trains, then?" asked Jim. O'Malley shrugged. "Something had been given Dave's cabbage patch quite a seeing to," he said, "but I saw no footprints." "Neville put the wee lad out shortly after you'd gone." "Good thing too. Last thing we need is a camel hunt on the allotment." The two men rounded a corner and reached the professor's garden door. Here they paused a moment before passing through. Neither man knew exactly why he did this. It was an unconscious action, as natural as blinking or raising a pint glass to the lips. O'Malley pushed open the ever-unbolted door, and he and Pooley entered the magical garden. The blooms swayed drowsily, and enormous bees moved amongst them, humming tunes which no man knew the words to. The professor turned not his head from his writing, but before his two visitors had come but a step or two towards the open French windows, he called out gaily, "Good afternoon, John, Jim. You are some distance from your watering hole, with yet half an hour's drinking time left upon the Guinness clock." Pooley scrutinised his Piaget wristwatch, which had stopped. "We come upon business of the utmost import," he said, knowing well the professor's contempt for the mundane, "and seek your counsel." "Enter, then. You know where the decanter is." After a rather undignified rush and the equally tasteless spectacle of two grown men squeezing together through the open French windows, Pooley and O'Malley availed themselves of the professor's hospitality. "You're looking well, sir," said Jim, now grinning up from a brimming shot crystal tumbler. "Are you engaged upon anything interesting in the way of research at present?" The old man closed his book and smiled up at Pooley. "The search for the philosopher's stone," he said simply. "But what of you fellows? How goes the golfing?" O'Malley brought his winning smile into prominence. "We pursue our sport as best we can, but the council's henchmen have little love for our technique." Professor Slocum chuckled. "I've heard tell of your technique," he said.
and I suspect that your chances of membership to Glen Eagles are pretty slight. I myself recently followed up some reports of UFO sightings above the allotments at night, and my investigation disclosed a cache of luminously painted golf balls. Although your techniques are somewhat unorthodox, your enterprise is commendable.
The old man rose from his desk and decanted himself a gold watch.
So,
he said at length,
to what do I owe this unexpected pleasure?
Pooley made free with a little polite coughing and drew out the now official handbook of allotment golf, which he handed to the professor. The snow-capped ancient raised his bristling eyebrows into a Gothic arch.
If you seek an impartial judgment over some technicality of the game, I will need time to study this document.
No, said Jim, on the back. Professor Slocum turned over the dog-eared exercise book, and his dazzling facial archway elevated itself by another half-inch.
So,
he said,
you think to test me out, do Jim?
Pooley shook his head vigorously. No, sir, said he, to the accompaniment of much heart-crossing. No ruse here, I assure you. The thing is as rightly perplexed, and that is a fact.
As such it would,
said Professor Slocum. Crossing to one of the massive bookcases, the old man ran a slender finger, which terminated in a tiny girlish nail, along the leathern spines of a row of dusty-looking volumes. Selecting one, bound in a curious yellow hide and bearing a heraldic device and a Latin inscription, he bore it towards his cluttered desk.
Clear those Lemurian maps aside, please, John, he said. And Jim, if you could put that pickled homunculus over on the side table, we shall have room to work.
Pooley laboured without success to shift a small black book, roughly the size of a cigarette packet, but clearly of somewhat greater weight. Nudging him aside, the professor lifted it as if it were a feather and tossed it into one of the leather-backed armchairs.
Never try to move the books, he told Jim. They are, you might say, protected.
Jim shrugged hopelessly. He had known the professor too long to doubt that he possessed certain talents which were somewhat above the everyday run-of-the-mill.
Now,
said the elder, spreading his book upon the partially cleared desk,
let us see what we shall see. You have brought me something of a poser this time, but I think I shall be able to satisfy your curiosity. This tome, he explained, fluttering his hands over the yellow volume, is the sole remaining copy of a work done by one of the great masters of, shall we say, hidden law.
We shall say it, said John, and leave it at that.
The author's name was Cagliostro, and he dedicated his life, amongst other things, to the study of alchemaic symbolism, and in particular the runic ideogram.
Aha, said O'Malley. So it is a rune, then, such as I thought it to be.
First I've heard of it, sniffed Pooley. It has the outward appearance of a rune, the professor continued, but it is little more complex than that. Your true rune is simply a letter of the runic alphabet. Once one has mastered the system, it's fairly easy to decipher the meaning. This, however, is an ideogram, or ideograph, which is literally the graphic representation of an idea, or ideas through the medium of symbolic characterization.
As clear as mud, said Jim Pooley. I should have expected little else.
You will bear with me a while. I shall endeavour to make it clear to you.
The professor straightened his ivory-framed spectacles and settled himself down before his book. Pooley turned his empty glass between his fingers.
Feel at liberty to replenish it whenever you like, Jim, said the old man without looking up.
The pendulum upon the great Omolu mantel clock swung slowly, dividing the day up, and the afternoon began to pass. The professor sat at his desk, the great book spread before him, his pale, slim hand lightly tracing over the printed text. Pooley wandered aimlessly about the study, marvelling at how it could be that the more closely he scrutinised the many books, the more blurry and indecipherable their titles became. They were indeed, as the professor put it, protected. At length he rubbed his eyes, shook his head in defeat, and sought other pursuits. O'Malley, for his part, finished the decanter of 5-year-old Scotch and fell into what can accurately be described as a drunken stupor. At very great length, the mantel clock struck 5. With opening time at the Swan drawing so perilously close, Pooley ventured to inquire as to whether the Professor was near to a solution.
"Oh, sorry, Jim," said the old man, looking up. "I'd quite forgotten you were here."
Pooley curled his lip. It was obvious that the Professor was never to be denied his bit of gamesmanship.
"You have deciphered the symbol, then?" "Why, yes, of course. Perhaps you would care to awaken your companion."
Pooley poked a bespittled finger into the sleeper's ear, and O'Malley awoke with a start.
"Now then," said Professor Slocum,
closing his book and leaning back in his chair,
"your symbol is not without interest. It combines 2 runic characters and an enclosing alchemic symbol. I can tell you what it says, but as to what it means, I confess that at present I am able to offer little in the way of exactitude."
"We will settle for what it says, then," said Jim.
"All right."
Professor Slocum held up O'Malley's sketch and traced the lines of the symbol as he spoke.
"We have here the number 10, here the number 5, and here, enclosing all, the alchemic C."
"A 5, a 10, and a letter C," said Jim. "I do not get it."
"Of course you don't. It's an ideogram, the expression of an idea, if I might be allowed to interpret loosely."
The 2 men nodded.
"It says, 'I am C, the 5th of the 10.
The 2 men shook their heads. "So what does that mean?" asked O'Malley.
"Search me," said Professor Slocum. "Was there anything else?"
Pooley and O'Malley stared at each other in bewilderment. This was quite unlike the Professor Slocum they knew. No questions about where the symbol was found, no long and inexplicable monologues upon its history or purpose. In fact, the big goodbye. There was one other thing," said the rattled O'Malley, drawing a crumpled cabbage leaf from his pocket. "If it's not too much trouble, I wonder if you'd be kind enough to settle a small dispute. Would you enlighten us as to what species of voracious quadruped would have wrought this destruction upon small Dave's cabbage patch?"
"His Pringlia antiscorbutica?"
"Exactly." O'Malley handed the Professor the ruined leaf. Professor Slocum swivelled in his chair and held the leaf up to the light, examining it through the lens of a horn-handled magnifying glass.
"Flattened canines, prominent incisors, indicative of the herbivore. By the size and shape, I should say that it was obvious."
Swinging back suddenly to O'Malley, he flung him the leaf.
"I have no idea whatever as to how you accomplished that one," he said. "I would have said that you acquired a couple of jawbones from Gunnersbury Park Museum, but for the saliva stains and the distinctive cross-hatching marks of mastication."
"So do you know what it was, then?"
"Of course. It was Camelus bactrianus, the common Egyptian camel."
There was something very, very odd about Camelus bactrianus, the common Egyptian camel. Norman squatted on his haunches in his rented lock-up garage upon the Butts estate and stared up at the brute. There was definitely something very, very odd about it. Certainly it was a camel far from home, and had been conveyed into its present locale by means which were totally inexplicable, even to the best educated camel this side of the Sahara. But this did not explain its overwhelming oddness. Norman dug a finger into his nose and ruminated upon exactly what that very, very oddness might be. Very shortly, it struck him with all the severity of a well-aimed half-brick. When he had been leading the thing away to its secret hideout, it had occurred to him at the time just how easy it had been to move, and he recalled that although he, an 8-stone weakling of the pre-Atlas course persuasion, had left distinctive tracks, the camel, a beastie of an eminently greater bulk, had left not a mark. And now there could be little doubt about it. The camel's feet no longer reached the ground. In fact, the creature was floating in open defiance of all the accepted laws of gravity, some 18 inches above the deck. "Now that's what I would call it," said Norman, startling the hovering ship of the desert and causing it to break wind loudly, a thing which in itself might be tolerable in the sand-blown reaches of the Sahara, but which was no laughing matter in an 8x12 lock-up garage. "Ye gods," mumbled Norman, covering his nose with a soot-stained pullover sleeve. It was now that he noticed yet another untoward feature about the animal, which, had it been the property of the now legendary P.T. Barnum, would no doubt have earned that great showman a fortune rivalling that of Croesus himself. The camel had the appearance of being not quite in focus. Although Norman screwed up his eyes and viewed it from a variety of angles, the zero-gravity quadruped remained a mite indistinct and somewhat fuzzy about the edges. Norman took out an unpaid milk bill and scrawled a couple of dubious equations upon its rear. Weight being the all-important factor of his experiment, it was obvious that his calculations regarding molecular transfer were slightly at fault. He rose from his uncomfortable posture and, the air having cleared a little, picked up a clump of wisely commandeered cabbage leaves and offered them to the camel, now firmly lodged in the rafters. The thing, however, declined this savoury morsel and set up a plaintive crying which sent chills at the back of the scientific shopkeeper. "Shh, be quiet, damn you," whistled Norman, flapping his arms and searching desperately about for the wherewithal to silence the mourning creature. Something drastic would have to be done, of that there was no doubt. This camel, although living proof of his experiment's success, was also damning evidence against him, and its disclosure to the public at such a time, when he stood poised on the very threshold of a major breakthrough, could only spell doom to his plans in dirty big red letters. Norman groaned plurally. That must not be allowed to happen. He had had run-ins with the popular press before, and he knew full well the dire consequences. Some way or other he would have to dispose of his hovering charge. Perhaps he could merely await nightfall, then drag it outside and allow it to float away upon the wind. Norman shuddered. With his luck, the camel would most likely rise to a point just beyond reach and hang there for all the world to see. Or far worse than that, it might sweep upwards into an aircraft flight path and cause a major disaster. These thoughts brought no consolation to the worried man. The camel was still bewailing its lot in excessively loquacious terms, and Norman, a man who was rapidly learning the true meaning of the word desperation, tore off his pullover and, having dragged the mourning beastie momentarily to ground level, stuffed the patchwork woolly over its head. A blessed silence descended upon the lock-up, and Norman breathed a twin sigh of relief. Perhaps, he mused, with its obviously unstable molecular structure, the camel might simply deteriorate to such a point that a slight draught would waft it away into nothingness. This seemed a little cruel, as the camel was something of an unwilling victim of circumstance, and Norman was not by nature a cruel or callous man. But, considering the eventual good which his great quest would bring to the people of Brentford, the shopkeeper considered the sacrifice to be a small and necessary one. It will thank me for it in the end, he told himself, to die in so noble a cause. I shall see to it that a memorial is built, the tomb of the unknown camel. We might even organise some kind of yearly festival in its honour. Camel Day, perhaps. Hold it on Plough Monday, incorporate a few Morris dancers in Egyptian garb and a maypole or two. Make a day of it. Yes, the camel had played its part, and it would not go unrewarded. Anyway, thought Norman, if it doesn't simply evaporate, I can always speed the process up with a decent-sized wee killer bomb.